Hello and welcome to Student Affairs Live. Thanks to those of you who are joining us a few minutes late today. We're having some technical issues. I am your host, Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Today, we are talking about the many implications of the upcoming election on our work with student affairs and in higher ed. We welcome your comments, questions, and participation. Follow along on the back channel and tweet to our hashtag Higher Live. I have two folks who are helping out with our back channel today, hoping for lots of engagement. So thank you to Valerie Ruska and Alex Sylvester. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the three individuals who have joined me today. But first, I need to acknowledge and thank those who make Student Affairs Live possible. Student Affairs Live is a part of the Higher Live Network, and you can tune into episodes with my friend and co-host Tony Duty and me on Wednesdays at 1. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. ACPA, College Student Educators International, is pleased to provide support for Student Affairs Live, one of the many ways that you can be innovative in your professional development. So today is November 2nd, and we are less than a week away from the 2016 election. Suffice it to say, it's been an interesting political season. Perhaps I'm not alone in thinking that this election has felt very different from that of years past. We're facing an increasingly polarized national climate, tension-filled and often hostile discourse in the 24-hour news cycle, and yet at the same time we're also witnessing apathy, disillusionment, and disengagement, even among our college students who have the most to lose and most to gain, I suppose. I think my three panelists will agree with me that understanding and engaging in our democratic processes, which includes but is not limited to voting and elections, is perhaps more important today than ever before. This election, regardless of whether we're talking about the President of the United States or the state representative from your district, will have implications for our work in student affairs. On today's episode, I am thrilled to be joined by three individuals who are all actively engaged. Joining me are Dr. Julie Payne-Kirchmeier, the Associate Vice President and Chief of Staff at Northwestern University. Hi, Julie. Also, we have Dr. Vijay Pendakur, who is, as of January 2017, the new Dean of Students at Cornell University. Hi, Vijay. And we have Dr. Nancy Thomas, who is the Director of the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University. Her institute administers the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement. So as we get started, and each of them shares a little bit about their background, we're also tweeting out a link to our website where you can view detailed bios. So we are going to begin with general introductions, talk a little bit about your role on campus and any other things that you'd like to share relevant to this episode. And then if you could each also share one specific challenge and one specific opportunity within this election. And Nancy, I'm going to start with you today.
All right. Thank you, Heather, and thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. I direct, as you pointed out, this institute at Tufts University. It is housed in the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life, which is a pretty unique structure among higher education institutions. Our dean sits at the table with the other academic deans, and we are responsible for civic education across campus, including the graduate programs. In addition to that, we have a very robust research arm, and there are two research areas, one having to do with youth engagement more broadly, and that's Circle, and they're very well known right down the hall from me. And then our institute studies higher education. And in particular, we're home to this very large national study for learning, voting, engagement, affectionately called NSOLVE. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So that's who I am, and that's where I sit. In terms of challenges and opportunities, well, I guess I think they're one and the same. I see that the big challenge right now is, how do we talk about these issues? How do we get across these polarized discourse? How do we engage with each other in ways that are productive? And while I think as a nation, we're perhaps not doing a great job, and our politicians may not be modeling the kind of discourse that we hope to see. I also view this as an opportunity. I think we can do better, and that's what we'll probably talk about today.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Vijay, welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on the program. My name is Vijay Pendakur. I'm currently in between jobs, but I wrapped up my term as an associate vice president at Cal State Fullerton recently, working on issues of student success, graduation planning, and equity, particularly for low-income and first-generation college students and students of color. And moving starting in January into the role of Dean of Students at Cornell University, where I'll be focused on issues of diversity, inclusion, and social justice for students at Cornell. And in the variety of roles I've held as a student affairs educator, I would say that aspects of critical multiculturalism and working with students on the margins of our campuses really sort of runs through the arc of my career. In terms of one specific challenge and one opportunity, that is a tough task given this political moment we're in. I think to be brief about it, I would focus on the two sides of the social media coin, right? I think that the opportunity, I'll start with the positive. The opportunity we have with social media right now is a much more exciting level of engagement, particularly from young people in rigorous political debate that I didn't see. I will speak from my own experience, that I didn't see prior to the advent of social media. I see young people posting articles from The Guardian UK, right? They weren't reading The Guardian before Facebook. So I think that's a huge opportunity. The inherent challenge in social media as a discourse channel, however, is I also see students posting things from sites that barely count as news, that definitely don't count as journalism, that don't have much veracity in the claims that they're making, that aren't fact-based and are not contributing to a rich, intellectually grounded dialogue. And they're posting those with the same weight as they would their investigative journalism share from The Guardian. And so I think a major challenge we have is sort of the watering down or maybe toxifying of what we consider to be reasoned discussion in our society because of everything being considered valid as long as you can share it or retweet it. And I think that that's a really difficult challenge to surmount from the place of a student affairs educator, because we're dealing with digital natives that have grown up in this culture.
Very well said. We are definitely going to talk more about social media as well. That was a great intro. JPK, Julie, welcome.
Hello, and thank you, just as the others have said, for having us here. I'm excited about this conversation today. As Heather said, I'm Julie Payne Kirchmeyer. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm the Associate Vice President and Chief of Staff at Northwestern University. When I think about sort of the arc of my career, it has really focused on issues of not only working with graduate students and teaching and really helping them to equip themselves with the skills to really be great professionals, but there's also the gender arc. I'm really committed to issues of feminism and women's issues in higher education and beyond. And so when I think about how that equates to this election, and the first time we have ever seen a woman running for president of the United States, it's a different world. And how people react to that, how they talk about it, some of the comments that get made back and forth, as Vijay said, in social media, or even in, as others will call it, the mainstream media, feedback and reactions to this has been really interesting to see from a positive and a negative viewpoint, let's say. I'm right in line with Vijay when he talks about the opportunities and concerns, and you start talking about what this looks like in social media, and how do you invite people to dialogue in a space that in some way, shape, or form wasn't designed for in-depth dialogue. So that's been challenging. And then how are we equipping students with the skills to filter through all of the things that Vijay was just talking about? So what truly is news? What are facts? And where's the level of accountability that we need to have for ourselves? And how do we instill that in our students to be able to critically analyze the vast amount of information that's coming at them in a world that values a 20-second soundbite at best? So I think that both sides of that coin, we're getting a lot of information. We can be some of the most informed and engaged voters that we've ever seen. But how do we know what information is valid? And how do we help our students figure that out?
Great. Fabulous first intro. So we have so many great questions today. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. My next question has to do with the issues and their relationship to student affairs and our work in higher education broadly. So can each of you talk about what you feel the top issue is in this campaign based on its impact on student affairs in higher ed? Vijay, we're going to start with you.
Sure thing. Top issue. Wow. I think that I would be remiss just on a sort of a personal is political level to not name, for me, a top issue being the way that particular vulnerable communities on our campuses are gripped in a state of panic about the potential that we end up electing someone as president who might render them illegal, might kick off mass deportations, might shut down reconciliation policies that have been in place for over a decade, who might create roles where members of our Muslim community end up on the rolls in a very scary and sort of totalitarian kind of way. And I think that what, as someone who works primarily and often with students of color and low-income students and first-gen students, one of the top issues that from this election that really touches on student affairs is just the really direct impact that this election could have on our undocumented students and our Muslim students. Those are the two populations that come to mind first. It's bigger than that. I'm not saying it's only limited to that, but that's where my heart tells me to look first, because we are talking about like sort of Maslow's first order here, survival, right, coming up for some of our populations. And that's different than other elections. that's probably what comes to the top of my mind. I have so many things I want to share, but I want to also share mic time with my colleagues here. So let me turn it over.
Great. Julie, what's your top issue?
Well, if any of you can see the group chat that we have when we kind of talk to each other behind the scenes here, I just posted ditto times 10,000 to Vijay. And I equate this back to, and I'll just sort of evolve it a little, which is this whole, and it's not an issue that's on anybody's platform, but I see it as an issue that is directly impacting higher education and in student affairs. This level of fear that people have about this election, regardless of who they are voting for, and the exacerbation of that fear and how it's playing out in our ability to talk to each other. Back to Nancy's introductory point, how is this level of fear that's being perpetuated in a number of different ways hurting our ability to sit down and have a conversation about what the issues truly are? I don't think anyone can say that if they sat down and talked with somebody, first of all, do they? Right? Sit down and talk with somebody who is from an opposing point of view. How many times have you actually done that in a way where you can listen to the other person and aren't coming out of a space of fear and anger when you are having that conversation? And I use conversation loosely. So while not directly issue-based, yeah, that to me is underlying everything that's happening when we see debates playing out on screen, when we see the Friday afternoon bombs hit the media, when you see just the discourse or lack thereof that happens in social media platforms.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Nancy, your thoughts?
Well, when I hear issues, I hear public issues. And I think that it's interesting to see what young people are talking about, for example, on Facebook. And I pulled up some numbers from Facebook, and one of the big exchanges right now is on government ethics. So one misconception, I think, having to do with young people and college students is that they are so narrowly focused on the issues that they're almost self-absorbed issues. And that's really not what's happening this election, and maybe not in past elections either. The biggest issue on people's minds is income inequality, jobs, and the economy, and foreign policy, and social justice and civil rights, immigration, as Vijay mentioned, and education, access to education, college affordability. Those are the issues that are on the minds of a lot of Americans. I think the question for student affairs professionals is, how do we provide adequate space to have conversations about the issues that the students care about? And so it's hard to be an expert on every issue. You can't do it. So you've got to figure out what's the best way to provide opportunities for students to talk about the things they want to talk about.
So I definitely heard kind of around this topic, but earlier on in the campaign, we were talking about free college, we were talking about affordability, access. Have those issues left the space around what is impacting student affairs in higher ed? Any of you?
I could jump in on a thought on this. I think that, Heather, your point about earlier in the space or earlier in the race, how we saw a breadth of issues, and how the longer the race goes on, there's this sort of political myopia happening, right? That's actually probably one of the top issues, and that we haven't named yet, is sort of a narrowing of the field of discourse because of this really sort of vitriolic exchange between Hillary and Trump, right? And the way that someone who is doing what Trump is doing with the media, and he's very skillfully using the media, right, to narrow down the set of issues to a certain set of points, and then everyone else is responding to that, actually has left a whole bunch of things. If you look at what was going on in the primaries, a number of months ago, there was so many things on the table of peak interest, like Nancy's mentioning, from what our young people in our society is actually interested in right now, that are not on the table anymore, right? We're sort of down to talking about 2 or 3 things over and over and over again. And I would say for a healthy democracy, there's a major risk here, right? Because you can't you can't have a presidential election on just a handful of issues. Yet what's happened is that we have allowed so many things to drop off the table in this sort of mudslinging fistfight that's emerged.
And I'll add to that it's so interesting to me to see that it has gotten to this point. And when I think about where's the accountability and how are we as a nation holding people to account, that seems to be a huge missing link. And we talk to our students on campus about that all the time. If you are having a conversation and you hear something that you don't believe is true, or somebody says something that's not true, verifiably not true, how are we holding people to account? And I'm not going to single out, although I will publicly own, for those of you who don't know me, I am a Hillary Clinton supporter. I think I need to make that clear. But it's happening across the board, and it has been for some time. It's happening in down ballot elections where people aren't holding each other to account. So whose responsibility is that? Where does that start? And how do we help our students do that for themselves?
That's a great point. Nancy, so I'm really interested in the study that you all do at Tufts, and specifically, we've talked about these issues facing student affairs in higher ed. What do we know about students and their level of engagement? You have some data to talk about, do college students vote historically?
So yes, we're running a number of studies right now, but the big one is this national study on college student voting. This started in 2013. It is a system where campuses have to opt in. It's not automatic, but we can give colleges and universities their students' voting rate. And so by opting into the study, campuses let us use an enrollment record, and we marry it with voting data. And then we are able to do the calculations to provide campuses with a really cool report that then we use in a national database. And at this point, we have over 925 campuses in the study and a database of about 8.5 million college students. We have data for 2012 and 2014, and we will soon have data 6 months from now or so for 2016. So here's the bad news. The bad news is college students didn't vote in 2012, okay? So about 45% of college students actually turned out to vote. That is lower than I think anybody knew before we were able to merge these two amazing databases. It's also pretty disappointing. And when you break those numbers down by age, the younger the student is, the less likely they are to vote. So for 18 to 24-year-olds, the voting rate is 41%. So then you go to these midterm elections, 2014, and you will see that the voting rates are really bad. So for 18 to 21-year-olds, it's 13%. We have some campuses where 5% of their students voted in 2014. So this is not good. And because 2014 was actually the lowest voting rate for young people on record in 40 years, there's a fear that there's a downward trend going on. On the other hand, we do have a lot of data and indications that students are paying attention. Circle did a survey a couple of weeks ago, and of the college students in that survey, over 80% are following the presidential election. That's pretty amazing. The other thing we've seen since 2012 is a big uptick in activism. All sorts of activism, whether it's activism, Black Lives Matter, or it's activism around the election. This year, we have seen several Republican groups on campuses say they are not supporting Trump, being very outspoken in their reluctance to support Trump. We've seen students, we have one group of students at Furman University. They got their voting rates, they started looking into it, and they discovered that the local election officials were asking students in dorms to fill out additional surveys, questionnaires, asking them about their commitment to the local community. including things like where do you socialize or where do you go to church? The students then got a lawyer, they mobilized, and they sought a temporary restraining order. They got an injunction to stop those things from happening. And then they're going to go in for a permanent injunction. So the really interesting thing about this election is people are riled up. They're concerned. They are paying attention. But we've also seen similar levels of interest in past presidential elections. And the voting rates, they weren't good. So something is happening. One last number that I'll share with you. Only about 62% of 18 to 24-year-olds who actually register to vote then go on to vote. So something is happening between the day they register and the day they vote. They're dropping out. And maybe they haven't developed a plan. Maybe they're upset because they don't feel like they're being heard by candidates or campaigns. I think there could be so many reasons for it. But if we're going to zoom in on one thing that is specifically about an election, it seems to me we've got to get to the bottom of why bother to register if you're not going to turn out to vote.
Wow. Those numbers are indeed disheartening and disturbing. And I think the opportunity for institutions to do something about it, and the students particularly, that was really inspiring. Julie, you're at Northwestern. I'm curious how students are engaged on your campus and if any campus climate concerns related to the election have arisen.
So first of all, one of the things I was going to say is that when we think about our students and how they're engaged, there's some real tangible things that they are focusing on. And one, which is common on many campuses across the nation, is that getting people registered to vote. And so to hear Nancy talk about that statistic about how many actually show up to vote, the second component of that we're working on is how do we help students plan to vote, right? So where are the polling places, letting them know, encouraging them to go and do that. If they're voting in their home states, how are they actually either absentee voting? Are they making a plan to go home to vote? What does that all look like? We do have some students that are expressing some concern. They want to vote in their home state, but their home state is a swing state. And they keep hearing these things about poll watchers, and they're worried about what that means. So we're trying to help them understand what their rights are if they are inappropriately stopped on their way to vote. And I think many campuses are doing this, which is why it's great to see the level of engagement occurring on campuses. These forums, we're having debate watch parties. We have faculty there that are leading really in-depth conversations about things. But when you talk about campus climate, how are these events transitioning to the greater climate? We've got, on the flip side of that, some concerns that are being expressed in editorials in our newspaper and blog posts across the different social media outlets about conservative voters and specifically some Trump supporters that are feeling silenced on this particular campus because of where we're located. And also on institutions of higher education, we tend to be viewed as more liberal in general. And so where is the voice for the conservative group, right? So that's a big concern climate-wise. But then we also have what Vijay talked about right now in small groups of students becoming very concerned about what could happen should Trump be elected, and those policies that have been outlined in his campaign speeches starting to come to light. And that is, you can start to feel it. There's sort of a gestalt of the campus. You can start to feel the tensions get higher and higher and higher the closer we get to November 8th.
So Vijay, she just mentioned student activism and all the different ways that students potentially are engaging. Do you see this generation of college students engaging more purposely, perhaps in the election, but just in general, in making sure their voices are heard on campus, and how specifically related to some of those issues that have been forefronted within the campaign? And you've spoken about immigration, but certainly sexual assault, racism, others. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, so many, my colleagues have shared so many wonderful data points and perspectives. One of the things Nancy said a few minutes ago was that we've seen an uptick in political activism in our country since 2012, right? And I think that some of the interesting things I'm observing are that any of us that work with students on college campuses right now, I think are feeling an uptick in political activism in general, right? I mean, campuses around the country last fall saw student mobilizations unlike anything we'd seen in several decades, and continued activism surrounding issues like Black Lives Matter, the Dakota Access Pipeline, issues of sexual assault on and off campus, continue to boil and roil, right, on our campuses. And then you have a national election where the issues have narrowed over time, right? So part of what I often see is a student activism that does not see itself reflected in the national dialogue, right? So you have intense student activism on the Dakota Access Pipeline, no DAPL right now, right? And zero mic time from Washington on this issue, right? And that's one example of a disconnect. You can see the same thing from elements of the Black Lives Matter platform, right? And some of the issues of reform that they're calling for that are not getting any mic time in our current political election moment, right? And so I'm really thinking actively and trying to critically synthesize some of what Nancy shared about young people's interest versus young people's voter participation. And what we're seeing is high levels of interest, low levels of voter participation. And one of the ways that I think I can sort of armchair quarterback this and explain it is that there is a high level of interest right now. Students feel very engaged in a multitude of activist platforms, and there is a really painful disconnect between their energy, their engagement, and the issues of importance and passion for them. And sometimes livelihood, not even passion, straight up livelihood, right? And the sense that our potentially electable officials are totally disconnected from their reality, right? And I think you have to observe the level of excitement that young people had for Bernie, right? Because his platform was so attuned to things they care about. And a lot of his platform has sort of fallen into an obscured silence at this point in what's happening with our race right now. And so I think my concern around campus-based activism is that it's somewhat disconnected from our national political moment. And the challenge for us as student affairs educators is to track these things simultaneously and to make sure that we are supporting our students on the run-up to big election day, that we're having those engagement experiences where students can come together for the election watch events. How do we shift from watch parties to watch events, because it's not always a party for all of our students to watch these debates and have their communities and their families maligned by public figures, So how do we hold these events in spaces that are safe spaces for our students, so that, a great example in the Titan Dreamers Resource Center at Cal State Fullerton, they held watch events for each of the debates so that undocumented college students could watch the events in the safety of an undocumented student safe space. Same thing for campuses that have supports for our Muslim students. If you've got an imam or if you've got a campus Muslim prayer space, if you can hold your watch events there. I think we need to be attuned to the intersection between heightened identity salience that our students have because of their activist commitments, and how that heightened identity salience actually leaves them more vulnerable to the micro invalidations and the macro invalidations that our national political moment is offering them right now.
So fascinating. And I'm thinking about all of the ways that students' opinions are influenced. And you spoke earlier about social media, and certainly a lot of the activist movements are mobilizing via social media, but our families and pop culture and other online spaces also play a role. Vijay, can you talk a little bit about that? Like how students go about forming political beliefs, and you spoke a little bit already about the effects of social media on campus climate, but specifically around the election.
Sure. I'll say a few things, and I want to actually, we have a collegial back channel going here, and I want to make sure I tag Nancy in here, who has some powerful qualitative data to support some of what Julie and I have shared. And I always want to make sure our audience is empowered, not just with our anecdotes and opinions, but with some of the data that Nancy's center so diligently collects. I think political formation happens in a variety of ways. I'm not a political scientist by training, but I do have a depth of background in critical race theory and racial identity formation. And I think about, if for the student affairs folks tuned into this broadcast right now, old school, let's go old school, right? Crosses psychosocial nigrescence, right? What is one of the catalysts in someone forming their Black racial identity? And Cross was writing at a time very similar to now of heightened social conflict, right? And he said, witnessing and being involved in heightened social conflict is a catalyst for Black racial identity formation, right? So one of the things that I'm seeing right now that's very exciting and life-giving to me as a critical multiculturalist, a student affairs educator, and an activist is the heightened political formation that our students are experiencing, whether that be as women and male allies on issues of sexual assault based on national activism, whether that be folks who are allies to or members of our indigenous communities and their fight for humane treatment and their fight for clean water and their fight for the observation of treaty rights, whether that be the huge galvanizing force that Black Lives Matter has been for young people. We are seeing these social moments turn into identity formation for our students because they provide the cognitive dissonance to usher folks through the different spectrums and stopping points of asking questions like, well, who am I? How was I raised? How did I come to believe the things I believed before I went to college? Why do I feel uncomfortable with the Thanksgiving dinner table talk all of a sudden? Is grandma a racist? Those kinds of questions that oftentimes happen while you're in college are happening rapidly for our students right now. And that's exciting because it provides us an opportunity as student affairs educators to partner with our students and to help them deepen their engagement and deepen their political formation to enrich our civic democracy. Let me turn it over to Nancy, though, because she's got that data.
Please, Nancy. Oh, Nancy, we can't hear you. Uh-oh. Nancy, we can't hear you.
The dangers of technology.
I got it. Sorry.
Yay, there we go. Okay, now go.
So what Vijay just said was so spot on. What we're really talking about here is identity formation, and people need to form an identity as an activist, as a voter, as somebody who co-creates democracy, who sees themselves as part of a bigger community or a larger set of needs. So I think that was absolutely perfect. What we've been doing is visiting campuses. We've done some modeling to identify the indicators for voting, and then by flipping it around, we can calculate a predicted voting rate for campuses in addition to their actual voting rate. And we have been visiting the campuses that have voting rates way higher than predicted. We've also visited a couple way lower. And we are seeing some emerging patterns, if you will. And a lot of what both, just everybody has been talking about are things that are emerging from our research. So for example, controversial issue discussions is critical in every nook and cranny of a campus. Student activism that is welcomed by an institution. Too many colleges and universities get in the way of activism. They don't listen to the students. Students need to learn that they have agency, that they have voice. And on the campuses that we visited with the high voting rates, these students were empowered. They had a voice. One of my favorite stories involved a bunch of students who they were the student government, very powerful group on campus, very well respected by their peers and by the administration. And they decided that they wanted to have a vigil when Nelson Mandela was passing away. And they got 400 candles, and people went out onto the patio and lit the candles. And one group of students was on the phone calling the media saying, come down here, photo op. They're going to be politicians. And the other group of students is calling the politicians saying, come down here, photo op, the media will be here.
Brilliant.
very powerful voices. You know, campuses would whisper to us, we stay out of their way. Mm. We respect them. On another campus, while we were there, a protest erupted over a personnel decision. And instead of quashing it, the president came out of the office and joined the group and sat there and talked with them for a couple of hours until there was enough transparency, as much as can happen in a personnel matter, and the students were satisfied. And I'll just make one other comment about the findings there, and there are more findings than this. But the other one that's really critical to what we're talking about today has to do with social cohesion. And this is such a critical role for student affairs people. There has to be a safety behind the political engagement. There has to be a level of cohesiveness among students, between students and faculty, between the different constituencies on a campus, in order for these relationships, this activism, the networks, and the dialogue to thrive. And I'll stop there.
This is perfect. So we know that one of the main issues that people have been talking about is how do we, as student affairs educators, either talk about our perspectives, not talk about our perspectives, be transparent. There's certainly tension within that space. So I'm curious, Julie, if you want to talk a little bit about what role we play as student affairs educators in deepening a conversation. And then also, are there risks to us as student affairs educators in being politically transparent and active in election, and particularly in those public spaces like on social media and Facebook where lots of students see us?
Well, since I know absolutely nothing about this,
it's a perfect question for you.
Being the person that's already outed who she votes for on this particular broadcast. So I think this is something that I struggle with. Not necessarily personally, but when I think about our profession as a whole, you know, there is something at the core of who we are as student affairs professionals that tells us we are here to help and bring as many people into a dialogue and a conversation and into educational moments as we possibly can. And how we do that happens through a number of different ways. But one of the most fundamental ways that happens is by being genuine with our students, because you can't have those conversations if you approach it from a disingenuous frame. And if we are expecting our students to not only struggle with some of the things that Vijay was just talking about as they form their own identity, crystallizing their values, or at least starting to think about what those are and how those may be different from what they came in the door with, and then expect them, and we tell them this all the time, we want you to be able to speak about your values. We want you to be able to go out and champion those and live in congruence with those same values. And that we as student affairs educators then say, but we can't do that. That to me is a very disingenuous exchange. And so how can we help students with those critical thinking skills? I think we have to be honest with them, first of all. It doesn't mean you have to run through the hallways and wave banners, but you can at least acknowledge that you also have a salient identity, a political identity, that you also have agency, and that maybe you are an activist. Just Vijay saying on this broadcast that he is also an activist is an important step forward from where I think we were even 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago in the profession. And so when you think about those public spaces, I have to own as a student affairs professional that when I speak that truth, there's going to be a whole host of responses to that, right? Some are going to be positive, some are going to be negative from my frame. Some may actually impact my career in ways that I wouldn't think they should, right? I know for a fact that because of who I am and what I say, there are campuses in this, in the nation and across the world that will never hire me. And I'm okay with that. And to me, that's a part of speaking my truth. And so how we encourage students to do that, equipping them with these skills, whether it be about resiliency, how you have a conversation, how you think about what you're going to say before you say it, really sitting back and understanding the concepts of intent versus impact, inviting people in instead of calling people out, I think can really set a frame so that people can be healthy. Thanks for the snaps, Vijay. They can be healthy and create those moments that Nancy talked about of social cohesion instead of divisiveness.
Well said, well said. So I think you brought up a really important point, which actually Vijay has recent experience with, having just been in a job search. And I know folks who are currently in job searches who are trying to balance, how transparent are you with your political beliefs when you're also trying to be a successful candidate in an institution search. Can you talk a little bit about how you work through that, any struggles that you face in that, Vijay?
Sure, definitely have not figured this out by any means, on the journey for sure. But, and I think it's a particularly vulnerable time when you're on a job search, right? Because oftentimes job searches are being done because you want a specific job, but sometimes job searches are being done from a place of economic need, right? So I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this and pretend that we can always risk bringing our truth and possibly miss out on an opportunity depending on what constraints and obligations an individual has in their personal life and who they're taking care of. But that being said, I think that Julie used a word a couple of times that I think is really at the center of this issue for me, and that's the word how. I think often we focus on what when we're talking about politics. What do you believe? What are you going to do, right? What stands are you going to take today and tomorrow? What did you say and what didn't you say? Particularly when I'm in public spaces, when I'm serving in the role of a keynote speaker, when I'm interviewing for jobs, when I'm up in front of crowds, I try and balance my what with my how. And what I mean by that is I do actually try and be transparent about what I believe and what I've lived through that has brought me to that belief and whose experiences I have witnessed that have engendered that belief, right? But I also simultaneously try and role model my how, which is as a person of deep belief and as a person of deep conscience, I am going to take a stand on certain issues. At the same time, I'm going to show you how I can take a stand on an issue that might be very different than where you stand and deeply respect your humanity in the way that I do that. And it's in that how that I've found through personal experience that folks who even might find what I'm saying to be totally deplorable to say, okay, all right, I don't agree with you, brother, but I can stay in the room with you because you're treating me like a human being, right? I've watched Cornel West debate conservative intellectuals multiple times on college campuses, and he does a really beautiful job of constantly using the religious and spiritual language of human love amidst these heated debates. Where people are talking about, is slavery America's original sin? And the conservative intellectual are saying things that I'm like, oh, Dr. West is about to come out of his chair. And he's not, right? He's sitting there and saying, okay, I love you, brother, but I disagree with you, And so I think we need that kind of role modeling for ourselves in our own education as student affairs professionals so that we can inhabit that kind of a how as we enter and move through different spaces that students are in.
We're all doing snaps. Absolutely. That's great. So Nancy, I think this concept that there's a necessity for neutrality is fascinating. And it's, I don't know who promoted this idea. If you can talk a little bit about how and how this also relates potentially to free speech within an academic context and, what you all have been doing at Tufts specifically.
Yeah. So I have a couple of thoughts on this. One is based on our research, of course, and the absolute common refrain on some of these high outlier campuses that free speech is in the water. It is what we do. It's understood. We are all behind free speech. But I also observed that free speech is not absolute. There are times and places where free speech doesn't work, such as in a classroom. You cannot be disrespectful in a classroom. You cannot make somebody else's learning environment toxic. But that then becomes a very difficult challenge. Does an institution regulate that, or do you educate for it? And I would advocate for both educating and also for allowing students to take ownership of bad speech. And by that, what I mean is something that we observed just about a month ago involving some very derogatory posters that had been put up on a campus in response to a Black Lives Matter protest, and it said, white lives matter too. And there was just a big back and forth. When the Black Lives Matter students protested, they probably had 15 to 20 people. 2 nights later, they had 400. It wasn't that the poster was censored. It was that the community said, not in our community. And this was student-driven, student voice, student activism. Another great example was a campus that didn't want Donald Trump speaking because they have a lot of undocumented students, a lot of first-gen immigrants, and they felt that this was insulting to the students. And they petitioned and prevented him from speaking in that he wanted to rent the hallway to do a campaign thing. It wasn't that he had been an invited speaker and they were shutting him down. It was more of a, well, no, wait a minute, we own this space and we want to make a political statement about our peers and what matters to all of us about immigration and our future lives together. So I think that that's one piece of it. Meet bad speech with more speech. Allow students to have ownership. But the last thing I'll say about neutrality is I don't think it's realistic. We're not neutral. None of us are neutral. You want to have a dialogue on climate change, you're doing that because you want to see changes in behavior. You aren't neutral. What I do think, though, is we have to provide spaces for dissenting voices. And then we have an obligation to allow for a broad range that sort of falls under the umbrella of impartiality. All perspectives matter. All perspectives are given a fair hearing. When that happens, there isn't the drive to be neutral so much. It's a question of fairness. Are you being fair about how you set up learning spaces or spaces for discourse or spaces for action even if you are impartial or not neutral. And one last thing, I don't think we should be impartial about democracy. I think none of us should be neutral about democracy. I'll stop there.
Wow, that was like a mic drop moment, right? So we have been talking about students, we talked about engagement, we've talked about our own personal roles, kind of all leading up to this. And it's hard to believe 1 week from today, it will all presumably be over, this election at least. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time, and we're going to go a little bit past the hour because we started late, talking about what we need to do on November 9th, what we need to do 1 week from today after the election, regardless of the outcome. Nancy, can you talk a little bit about this? And maybe it's about the fact that it's not over. The election is only one part of our broader democracy.
Right. So I think of elections as teachable moments. They are not it's almost like saying I'm getting married and the last day that I care about it is my wedding day. That's not it. It's the day after the wedding where the hard work starts. And that's what's happening in this election. I think people are so upset by it, so disillusioned, so disheartened with the choices they have. My answer to that is, so what are you going to do about it? Don't just no show at the polls and then gripe the next day. No, that's when colleges and universities need to start their curriculum, start their co-curricular activities, start their movement toward a more inclusive campus climate that values political discourse and dissent and takes care of each other and creates learning communities and social cohesion and nurtures activism. These are things that happen 365 days a year, not on election day. So that, I think, is the most important message. Now, I also would say, and this is something that I lie awake at night worrying about, and I'm just going to lay it on the table. I do not think we are prepared for the day after.
Mm-mm.
I don't think campuses are talking about it, figuring it out, because people are going to be upset no matter what the outcome is. And you've got some social cohesion that has been broken down in this election. You're going to have to figure out what you're going to do to bring it back together, or if you never had it, make it better than it was before. I know at Tufts University, we are setting aside a room. We're putting newsprint all over the wall. We're opening the room up for 4 hours, and we're handing everybody markers. Come in and tell us what you're thinking. Open space, have at it. But that's just one idea. And I've heard other good ideas, but I'd really love to hear from Vijay and Julie on their ideas.
Julie, why don't we go to you first? Can you talk a little bit about, should we be prepared? Why? And then how?
There's absolutely no doubt that we should be, but I think the big challenge for us right now is we just don't know. So this is, as we've talked about, unprecedented. And, we have this, we've had divisive elections in our history, right? We've had some real vitriolic elections in our history, and we can talk about that for another hour and a half if you want, but it's never played out like this. It's never been on a 24-hour news cycle. It has never been highlighted in social media and sort of steeped in that brew that Vijay talked about earlier of all information being seen as equal in some way, and non-facts being represented as facts, and accountability. And so the things that we may have done, so think back to 2008, right, when we had another historic election on our hands. How did we prepare for that? I don't know that we did. I remember celebrations breaking out across campus, and we sort of managed it like we would another large outdoor event. And I don't think that's what's going to happen this time, regardless of who walks away with the presidency. I think we have to, as Nancy said, find ways to help people understand that democracy isn't just about voting in an election. It's about what you do the next day. How do we help our students take that passion and that energy, regardless of who they supported, and now move into what is your role in governance? What is your role in accountability? If the person that is elected is somebody that you vehemently do not agree with, how do you in turn utilize your voice and your activism in order to make sure that your rights are protected in some way? It's not all about the presidency. We have 3 branches of governance. Now, the challenge with this election, though, is that the presidency, control of the Senate, and the Supreme Court are all at stake. And so I think that's also adding to the pressure. So while the Supreme Court won't be decided right away, what is their role in working with legislators when it comes down to who is nominated and how they want their voice to be heard? And so I think that's where we should be focusing our efforts. I think we should also be, in the short term, working to provide spaces of support for students who are going to be going through a lot. And depending on who actually wins the presidency and what the control of the Senate looks like, it's going to be different groups of people who are experiencing those challenges and that frustration. How are we equipping our staff to talk about those things? Do we have information in their hands? We're here in Chicago talking about what happens, and here we go again, when the Cubs win the World Series tonight. Sorry, Cleveland. But we talk about these major athletic events, but this is so much bigger and has the potential to be far more impactful for a longer period of time. And so I agree with Nancy. I think we need to figure out what to do and more of it. Yeah. But I don't know that we're fully equipped to know what that is.
So Vijay, I think Student Affairs is uniquely positioned. This is our skill set, is to coordinate and discuss and have good conversations with students. What should we be doing specifically on the day after the election? Like, if you had to direct a staff of student affairs professionals the day after, what would you encourage them to do?
I think that Nancy and Julie have done a great job of naming the support roles that campuses and student affairs professionals can play. So I won't repeat those points. I do think, in addition, obviously, to the support roles, that student affairs educators can be a critical part of what American campuses have done for civic democracy for a very long time, which is the teach-in, right? So there's actually a element of student affairs education, which is about our own expertise and our own training. And faculty have held teach-ins during the 1960s, anti-war movements and civil rights movements. Faculty have held teach-ins during the 1980s, divestment movements from South African apartheid, and during the solidarity movement with Nicaragua and the sanctuary movements, right? So that they have actually used their content expertise to help students deepen and enrich their own understanding of issues that the news media is not teaching them about, right? So part of what I see our role as a student affairs educators, and this is because of my own sort of personal bent as a critical multiculturalist, is how do we make up for this political myopia, where so many key issues that have not been included in this political discourse, but that our students care about, and that are often they're like, well, they didn't talk about the thing that I'm really interested in. And so part of what we can do is create forums for students to remain vitally engaged, because that engagement level translates into democracy beyond voting, to talk about Nancy's so important point, right? How do we move democracy beyond voting? Well, we have to provide frameworks and forums for young people to continue a vital sense of engagement in political issues beyond voting. And so the time for powerful teach-ins, speaker series, and enhancing the knowledge, awareness, and skills of our students to live in a complex and multicultural world is on November 9th and every day thereafter, right? So I think that the other thing student affairs professionals can do, I'll make a short point about this, is to attend to their own self-care on November 9th and every day thereafter, because just like our students, we're involved in this really intense political moment, and we might be feeling devastated by what happens. And part of the awesome opportunity we have as student affairs professionals is not just to represent some sort of like monolithic, educator space, but actually to be authentic and complex and three-dimensional humans, and to share our own grief in appropriate ways with the students that we work with, and to share what we're doing to take care of ourselves, to role model self-care for our students. Because the other piece is that this could be one of those emotional straws that breaks the camel's back for our students and sends them into a tailspin. So how do we transmit to our students that we're taking care of ourselves, so that they go, oh, okay, I respect Julie, and look, she's actually taking time out of her activism to do some self-care, so I better do the same thing too. And that self-care piece, I don't think can be underrated for us as professionals, for our own sustainability in the work, and then for our role as educators and role models as well.
I completely agree with you on that. So we are going to move into final thoughts. I'd like each of you to share one final thought and one resource that you would like to share with the folks who are watching today. Nancy, we have a lot of links from you. Many of them have been tweeted out. We're going to tweet out some more and post those on our website as well. But Vijay, why don't we start with you?
Okay, wow, final thought. One part of my final thought will be gratitude. I'm very grateful to be invited into this circle of learning and sharing. And I look forward to the ripple effect and the number of side conversations that hopefully this Higher Ed Live special spurns with my collegial community. I think that a final thought for me, I'm just going to paraphrase the great Nancy to say that democracy is more than voting. Voting is one day a year, and there's 364 other days. And the work of higher education to fortify a civic democracy that is strong and that is representative of its people is a daily work, and not a work constrained to a 4-year election cycle or a 2-year election cycle. And the more we can embody that as educators and change agents, the more our students will believe it. A resource, this is sort of out of left field because our conversation didn't drift in this arena, but I think a resource, if folks are sitting there going, what should I queue up in my YouTube next after I'm done with this Higher Ed Live, is anything that Mark Lamont Hill touches is gold. His ability to connect the domestic experience of U.S. politics to the foreign implications of U.S. politics is something sorely missing from our discourse and sorely missing from the way students are trained to think about U.S. politics. And for him to do that as a Black man, as a professor at Morehouse, is doubly more powerful. His allyship with the LGBT community, his allyship with indigenous populations is remarkable. And I think